So last time we changed our index so that there was an empty div called table div that when the page loads, a JavaScript file is run, build table.js. There's then an Ajax request is made to this URL that invokes this function, build to do table, which builds a partial view, which is our table. Then the Ajax inserts that table into the div. And that's where we got to. So this was the reason we're doing this is because we want to be able to add an item to the to-do list without going to another page, without refreshing the whole page, that kind of stuff. So that's what we're going to implement today. Before we start that, I had a thought, and I think this bit here, so this is what I've written before. There's a few things actually I can change here. Firstly, the index, we don't need to do this anymore because the index, the logic that gets the correct model or gets all the information for this view is in the build to do table. We don't need to repeat it in the index. So let's just make sure this still works. Excuse me. So yeah, it still works. Because it's the Ajax that's calling the other function to build that data. We don't need to do that twice. So that was the first thing. The second thing is that we've got a lot of code here in build to do table, which isn't really to do with building the to do table, which is getting the list of to dos, which is for the user that's currently in the web application. So I think that's something we're going to end up needing to use in some other functions. So I'm going to make that its own thing. So I'm going to have a private, and it's going to return an IEnumerable of to do. So a list of to dos, and I'm going to call it get my to dos. And it's going to be pretty simple. I'm going to just copy what we are doing down here because I'm not going to need that in there. So this, and then I'm going to return that. So I've just copied the code. It's now returning this rather than we're working out each time. And then I can basically change this down here. In fact, I can make this really simple now. This is just one line, get my to-dos. So there we go. So that means if I need to make another view, probably the edit view maybe, I can just, instead of keep repeating this code, I can just write this function. And let's check that that works. Let's go to my to-do list. And yeah, there it goes. It's working. So that's fine. So the thing we need to do is again, I keep coming back to this, we need to recreate this where I type, there's a form box on the page, I type something in, push enter, and it adds that to the server and updates the my to-do list on the page. So how are we going to do that? Let's go to the to-do to the index. The way we're going to do it is we're going to do it with an Ajax form using Ajax helpers. So this is our index. The table div is here, and that's going to be filled up by this build table. We're not going to need to say create, and do you know what? We're not going to. Do I want to change this? I'm not going to put that there. We don't want that. So I'm going to make a new div. I'm going to call ID equals, let's call it to do create form. ID for CSS selectors it should be unique. There's only, so like you can't have two elements with the same ID, or if you do, I don't know actually what would happen if you did that, but the idea is that an ID is how you get a specific element. So with this, we use the ID table div because we know that that's the only element on this page that's called table div, so we're going to be putting it in the right place. Now I'm going to use the Ajax helper to make this form. Now, do I make the form first or the action first? Let's think. I'm going to make the form first, and then we'll write the controller action to go with it. So I'm going to do using, and then we're going to do Ajax dot begin form, and then we're going to create our form in here. So the first argument is going to be the name of this works kind of like an action link. So we looked at HTML helpers where we built action links before, where we pass it a controller name and a controller action. We're going to do the same thing here. We're going to make an Ajax create method in our to-dos controller. So this Ajax form is going to, with the result, call this function. And then the next one is our Ajax options. So we'll come down here and we're going to do, let's bring that in here, new Ajax options. Actually, let's start again. Never very good at this kind of tabbing and stuff. So we want new Ajax options. Is that not working? Right, okay. Okay, now we've got our Ajax options. So we're going to come down here, new Ajax. I don't know why IntelliSense isn't doing this. It can sometimes be a bit finicky. Probably my fault because I was messing around with the tabbing. But what we want is we want insertion mode. So insertion mode is how is the Ajax going? What's the Ajax going to do with the result? And in this case, we want it to replace. We want it to replace the contents. Well, what we're doing, we're going to call this, we're going to write a control action. In fact, I'm wondering if it makes more sense to do the control action first. I'm going to do the control action first. Sorry about that. We're going to make a form, and our form is just going to be a text box. And we're going to type in description, push enter, and it's going to submit that string into a new to-do item. And then it's going to call this function to rebuild the table in the div above it. Okay, so let's do our create. We're going to want to create. We're going to basically copy this method, very similar to this method, except it's going to be done on an Ajax call. So I'm actually going to start off by copying it, and then we'll figure out how to change it. So we're going to call this Ajax create. So when a request is made and HTTP request is made using a form, the data is going to be submitted via post. We've said HTTP post here. And there's something called a model binding system in .NET that takes all the information from that post request, and it tries to match that up with the model that you're expecting. So in this, we've said we're expecting a to-do type. So it's going to look for, in this post, in all the post data, and look for things that have got ID, description, or is done. Now, if we didn't put this thing here called bind include, it would look for anything and try and insert anything it found. And what someone could do is someone could actually put create their own post request and add in a user ID. And if they happen to somehow find a way of doing it, they could maybe put a to-do list in for someone else, because the binder wouldn't know that unless we told it, look, you should only expect the ID description and if it's done or not. So that's what this is for here. Now we don't actually want to take in is done at this stage, because we're creating a new to-do list item. We know it isn't done, so we can take that out. So most of this is going to be the same. I'm going to set the to-do dot is done to false, because we've just created it. Save changes. We're not going to redirect, because with this one, remember how this one worked? We went to the create page, then we created it, and then we got redirected back to the index. We don't need to do that. We're going to stay in the same view. But we're going to return a partial view. And it's going to be the same as when we had this here. Okay. Ajax create. So there we go. So we are going. So what's happening is with our Ajax form, we're going to do a HTTP post request. The binding system is going to look at that information, and it's going to see that there's ID and a description. It's going to create a to-do object. If that model is valid, it's going to add the user information, set is done to false, add it to the database, save the changes, and then it's going to return a partial view of the user's to-dos using the getMyToDos function. Yeah, so remember we made this, that's a list of to-dos. So that's the function we want our Ajax request to call, or that's what the action we want it to take. The result, this partial view, we then want that to be put into the table div that we made last time. So let's go back to, let's get rid of that index. Yeah. So we're going to go in here. We're going to say using and then Ajax begin form. Aha, right, okay, I realize what the problem is. Up here in this view, we've got our model defined as a list of to-dos. Now our form is only going to be creating one. So we need to change this to get rid of the enumerable and just have to do. So the Ajax form is only going to create the one thing. That might actually not have been what was causing the error, but we're going to go with it. So our method is going to be Ajax create. And it's going to be in to-dos, the to-dos controller. And then we want a new Ajax options. And what we're going to add to this, we're going to have our insertion mode. Okay, there we go, it's better. Equals, so we're going to be, it's insertion mode dot replace. So we're going to be replacing the contents of table div, which probably when we're entering this form, there's going to be already something in there, because we've already ran this script build table. The contents is there, and we're going to want to add new items. So we're replacing what's in there. We're going to want a HTTP method and tell it to use post. And then we want the update target ID is equal to, this is going to be our div, which is table div. Right. Okay, so that is we've begun the form. So that's all the information that the form needs. Now we want to actually, well, that's the information the helper needs. Now we actually want to build the form itself. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the views to do create. Now we did this scaffolding, so let's use it. Right, we just want to do the all we want to do is the description. So that's here. So you can see model.description. So let's put this in here. Right, is that working? So, oh, we need to, there we go. So what we've got here now is we've got, well, the other thing we're missing is an anti-forgery token. So what this does is this sends basically a session ID along with the post information, which is validated here. This means if someone like steals your cookie or something like that, they can't keep using, they can't keep creating to-dos for you, because it's going to expect a session ID that only lasts, within a session. So it's a security feature. The other thing I'm going to enable is I'm going to load the validations, the client-side validation. Scripts.render, and then it is bundles. I just know what this is. .jQuery val. So what that is that's going to load all the scripts you need for validation with jQuery, and that means it's just a text box at the moment. We haven't got any real validation for it. But if we wanted to set like a maximum string length or a minimum string length, then it would check on the client side. It wouldn't check by doing the request and then getting a response back, which I think for an Ajax table, like if you're doing Ajax forms, that's what you really should be doing. I think client-side validation is important anyway for like a much quicker experience. You're told straight away, yeah, this is wrong, before it gets sent to the server. So this is what we expect to happen. Let's go through this again before we try it and make sure I haven't forgotten anything. So a user is going to browse to the to-do. So just /todos, right? So just to this URL /todos. The routing system is going to instantiate a todos controller class, which has a reference to our data context, our database, and it's going to call this function index, which returns the view. And because we haven't specified a specific view, it's going to look for the one that's the same name in the to-dos folder, which is index. This will all load, and there'll be an empty table div. Because we've added this script here, it's going to call the build table script. That's going to make an Ajax request to to-dos build to-do table. The routing system is going to figure out that means you want to call the function build to-do table in the to-dos controller, which is here. What that does is return a partial view, which is a view that doesn't have any layout associated with it. It's just HTML of my to-dos. So we wrote this function my to-dos here, which looks at the current user and then does a database query and finds all the to-dos for that user and returns them as a list of to-dos. Okay, and then this runs. This HTML is sent to this Ajax function on success, and then some jQuery here replaces the table div with the result. So this table div will be replaced with the table. Now what we've added since last time we tested it was this Ajax form. What this is doing, here we manually wrote the Ajax, we wrote the URL and everything. Here we're using the Ajax helpers in the framework, and we've said begin form, we want it to call the Ajax create method in to-dos. We want it to replace the contents of that div. The div we want to replace is table div, and we want it to be a post request. we had to change the model in index to a single to-do because that's now what our model on this page is all about. We're only going to be accepting the description, and we've just used the standard helpers to build this for us. We don't need to have a button because when you push enter, that automatically submits the form. So the Ajax create method is here. We've specified that the only things we want the only parameters we want the binder to look for are the description and the ID. We don't want it to look for any user information. That's stuff that we don't want. That's to stop overposting attacks. And if you're not sure what that is, give it a Google. That's going to take in the to-do object. It's going to associate the current user with that to-do. Its set is done to false. Add that to our database context, our database thing up here. There we go. And then it's going to save the database, and it's going to return a partial view. It's not going to change the view, and it's going to do the to-do date table, this partial view, with my to-dos, with the user's to-dos in it. Okay, so that's the theory. That's what should happen. So let's build it and go. So we've got our to-dos. We have a form. I might get rid of the label actually. We'll see. So if I type Ajax entry, there we go. Look at that. So that's quick as well. Like another. Okay, it's adding it straight away. Now the question is this actually working? So how do we check that? I'm going to go back to the home page. I'm going to go back to my to-do list, and they're all there. Yeah, so that's it. It's working. So this is we have got this functionality. Okay, we've got that. That's what we wanted. So where do we say the page shouldn't refresh when a user adds a new item? Done. Okay, I think this is quite good. So there we go. Now we obviously there's things we want to change still. Like for starters, we can't click is done. What we're going to end up doing is actually doing it in a similar way to this. Right, this is actually, do you know what? Because this is bugging me. I'm going to go here, stop it. I don't want the label. Let's see how that looks. That's better. There's a bit of a, I don't know. I'd prefer if that lined up and there was less padding. I mean, we could do that. So I'm not going to get too worried about formatting in this set of tutorials, but just to show you how you would go about it. So, right. This is how I do it anyway. Is that you can click on this element. So we've got this element here, and it tells you things like padding and where it got this styling from. So I'm not sure. You'd have to dig into it. Maybe it'd be this one. Maybe this one's controlling that. Yeah, see, so this is really good. Like, I think this is chain, like, I don't know. Maybe if you're like an experienced web developer, you probably think this is really, trivial. But if you're starting to learn like CSS and all this stuff, these tools are incredible because I've clicked on that div and I can mouse over here. So firstly, this is telling me everywhere where it got, how this got styled the way it is, because CSS is a cascading style sheet, or is that the right? Let's check this. Yeah, cascading style sheet, which means that you can keep adding rules to the same element and it cascades, which is really good for someone who has like accessibility problems. Maybe you have someone who has bad eyesight who needs to say, look, I need you to make all font, every element, you make the font size like whatever, like 20, minimum or something. And that's why it's useful. But it can get a bit complicated, and you've got all these things like position, margin, border. But look, I've selected this element, and I've got here, I can mouse over, and it's showing me on the screen that green is where the padding's come from. Okay, so I could make a rule to get rid of that padding. I could change this. Instead of using this class here, I could use a different class. In fact, probably the simplest way is to not use a class at all. So let's get rid of this class. See how this works. This might not work. Just saying. But it did. Right, so there you go. Okay, we could tell that that's what that padding, which we didn't want, was coming from that class. So by just getting rid of that, we now have it. It's lined up. I mean, I quite like that. So yeah, so I kind of lost. That was a tangent. So where are we? We can add items like really easily to this. What we can't do is we can't click is done. And so what we'll be doing is following the same kind of process as we did with this form, but we'll be turning these into individual, not so much forms, but there'll be selectors, and we can set events listeners on them using jQuery, and those then will fire off Ajax requests to do the stuff we want. I really hope this was useful and has started to make things come together. Now, I said in my introduction video that one of the difficult things about teaching this stuff is that it's really hard to pick a direction to start at. And perhaps if you've come to this video tutorial set with not very much knowledge, you're probably finding it quite difficult because of that. But I'm hoping if you've got a little bit of knowledge, if you're in my course, maybe we're halfway through the term and you're thinking about sitting down and start your project, that this will be helpful. That this will start triggering neurons and paths in your brain to figure this stuff out. Anyway, I completely lost what I was talking about because I got excited about the CSS. So yeah, so next time we're going to be adding the ability to check if this is done. But I think this is coming on quite nicely. As always, any questions, then ask me. You can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Sean Moulton, SEAN. Yeah, questions, comments, all great. So thanks for listening.